Yeah, so because the name of the parsha is Jethro, Moshe's father-in-law, so I just realized it's appropriate because today is the yahrzeit of my mother-in-law. So I guess this relation, Chani's mother, Rachel Bat Peretz, it's her second yahrzeit. So that's a special day for her, for us. So it should be in her memory. Okay, let's think about the Torah, the giving of the Torah, Ten Commandments, and there's a lot to talk about, but one place to start is really to ask the simple question of what exactly happened at the giving of the Torah. In other words, you could say at the giving of the Torah, the Jewish people got the information of what's, the will of God, what's moral, what's immoral. Humanity receives the Ten Commandments, and that's the basis of morality. That's all true. But if you start reading more carefully, you think about the ideas that there are hints, and certainly the Medrash says this, that some of this knowledge was available even before the Torah was given formally, right? So, for example, the sages say that the patriarchs and matriarchs kept the entire Torah even before the Torah was given. That's a statement in the Medrash, and people debate it and talk about what exactly that means. But it seems that, and also at the moment of the giving of the Torah at Sinai, we don't get all the information. In other words, there's 10 commandments are given and that's it. And the rest of the Torah, the rest of the law is really spelled out over the next 40 years until the end of Moses' life. Many commandments appear in Mishpatim, which is next week's parsha. But at this parsha, we have this major revelation. We have 10 commandments. And so is it just the beginning of formalizing the Torah, or is this new information? Is it old information that was just restated by God? So these are some of the questions that you think about. Another point to think about is that we talked about this a little bit on Thursday and on Tuesday, that if you would expect God to come and give us some information, maybe you would expect things that are earth-shattering. And many of the commandments in the Torah and the Ten Commandments specifically are not that earth-shattering. At least five, maybe even you can argue maybe six, maybe seven, are very common and just basic moral principles. Don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't lie, don't these are don't lie, don't testify falsely. These are the basics for any moral society. So the question is, do you really need God to come and tell us this information? And just to add to the question, there's a fascinating piece of Talmud that says that even if the Torah would not be given, we would learn ethical behavior from nature itself. So, for example, the Talmud says that if the Torah would not be given, you would learn that you're not supposed to steal from the insects, from the ants. I'm not an expert in ants, but at least the way the Talmud says it, ants don't steal from each other. They work really hard. They have colonies. They do a lot of work together, but they don't steal from each other. So in other words, what the Torah is saying is if the Torah would not be given, you could still look around nature and maybe you call it natural law and figure out certain moral principles. The Talmud then says you could learn modesty from a cat. I'm not a cat owner, so I don't know what that exactly means, but I think that cats are modest. So that just leads to the question. So if the cat knows this and the ant knows this, why do I need God to descend and give me this information? And what's the big deal when he does? There's this big overwhelming experience and this thunder and this lightning, and people are frightened, and people say we don't want to hear from God anymore, which we can talk about all these specific issues. But really, there's the essential question really hopefully allows us to branch out into many different discussions as well. So what's the essential point? The essential point is as follows. The essential point is that, and this is something that is very important to Chabad philosophy. Everything in Chabad philosophy or Hasidic philosophy appears earlier in the earlier sources, but people didn't necessarily give it the right amount of attention. So there's a medrash that says as follows. There was once upon a time there was a king, and the king made a decree. And he said that the people living in Rome shouldn't descend to Syria, and the people in Syria shouldn't ascend to Rome. That, in other words, there's a division, and everybody stays in their place. And then one day the king says, you know what? The people of Rome should go to Syria, and the people of Syria should go to Rome. And and he says, Ani hamatchila, I'll be the first one to go down. That's the medrash. And what is that? So that's the metaphor. What's the analog? So the medrash explains when God creates the world, there's a verse in Psalms that says, Hashamayim shamayim laHashem. The heavens are heavens for God, and the earth was given to humanity. So in other words, when the creation was built, when created in the beginning of creation, there is a built-in division and the built-in divide. It's on the counter. And the built-in divide between the physical and the spiritual. And the spiritual is one realm, and the physical is another realm. And there's a divide you cannot connect the two, because that's a decree. A decree in Hebrew, the word gzeira, decree, could also mean there's a to cut is ligzor. There is a division. There's a gap between physical and spiritual that cannot be bridged. Nothing can happen. So no matter what you can try to do, there's still you're on earth and you're physical, and then there's a spiritual realm, there's a spiritual reality, but there's no connection between the physical and the spiritual. And then what happens is the Torah is given, and what essentially happens is that the decree, the division between physical and spiritual is the decree is severed, the separation is severed. In other words, now there's a connection between heaven and earth. And that's why it says that Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, just like in the metaphor, God says, the king says, I'll be the first to go from Rome to Syria. God says, I'm going to begin. I'm going to come down to earth. And that's why the verse says, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, Moses descended on Mount Sinai. And then it continues, Vel Moshe Amar, and to Moses, God says, Alei Elokim, ascend to God. So that's what the Medrash says. And Hasidic philosophy, and specifically Chabad philosophy, looks at this Medrash and says, this is the key point. What does that mean? It means that if you could be the patriarchs and matriarchs, and they were very spiritual people, and they had great ideas and great philosophies about the oneness of God, and they were very spiritual, and they lived spiritual lives. But what happens is that spiritual life, that spiritual awareness cannot breach and cannot break into the physical reality. And in a very simply, what that means is the notion of a physical place or a physical object becoming holy is an impossibility, because it's two different realms. What does the physical have to do with the spiritual? So, for example, the Zohar says that when you read the stories of Jacob, and Jacob is shepherding the sheep of his shepherding the flock of his father-in-law, and there's this whole discussion where he puts the sticks in front of the sheep so they should mate, and their offspring should be different colors. So according to the Zohar, the book of Jewish mysticism, there's a lot of mystical concepts there, and the Zohar says, look, what we achieve through the spiritual service that we achieve through tefillin, Jacob achieves through the sticks. That's what the Zohar says. If you want more information, we can get into that, but that's not the discussion right now. The point right now is those sticks, those mitzvot that the sages did, were symbols for a spiritual reality. But those symbols themselves do not become holy. When Jacob finishes throwing the sticks, he could throw them in the garbage. We believe that once Sinai happens, once God descends into the physical world and says, I'm the Lord your God, and we could talk about each statement, I am the Lord your God. But the point here is that God descends into the physical reality. Now, there is the ability was given. God sort of breaks the barrier between the physical and the spiritual. And when you do something physical in the physical world, that physical object becomes a holy object, depending on to which degree. Yeah, there's there are different categories of holiness, and there are some things that are so holy that you can't dispose of them, like tefillin or a mezuzah or a Torah. And then there are other things that have a lesser degree of holiness. But ultimately, everything physical now has the ability to become holy. A hand that gives charity, that hand itself now is permeated with holiness. So in other words, if you want to think about this and you want to ask, what is the big deal? What is the big achievement that happens at Sinai? What did we know that Abraham didn't know? The answer is it's a completely different reality. Because with Abraham, with all his connection to God and with all his preaching about God, with all his teaching people about God, it means you can go to heaven, but you can't bring the heaven to the earth. You can't make the physical objects themselves be transformed. And the whole purpose of creation really is to transform the physical, but that was sort of impossible before. And that's the beginning of it is possible at Sinai, and that's why you need God's essence. Kabbalah talks about this, that when you say, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God, so represents another, um, every name of God represents another attribute. In other words, God himself is undefined. So you can't really give a name because a name is a description. So the question is, why do you have God's name? So the God's names is not the essence of God, it's the way God expresses himself. So every name represents another expression, which we can get into, but we really want to get to the Anochi, the I. But in the meantime, Bob, go ahead, please. Bavakasha.
So should we consider Sinai an optimistic moment or a pessimistic moment? Let me expand on that. Pessimistic because just like Eden, for the Jewish people, this was the pinnacle. This is the only time really where God came and broke bread with us, so to speak. Um, so should we see us as a pessimistic nation that only went backwards from that moment of reverie? Or should we see it like igniting a fire, that he came in as a flint that got the fire going, and then it's up to us to kind of find that flame again?
Yeah. So it's the latter, and we can elaborate. I can
I
elaborate
figured
upon
as
that.
much.
So give me a second. It's the latter. I'll elaborate upon that. But I just want to say that, so it's certainly the latter. I want to elaborate upon that. But I forgot my second point. So well, yeah, well, let me elaborate upon that. But it's certainly the latter. And optimism, pessimism. The answer is optimism. I'm biased,
Shock.
but I'll circle back to that. Absolutely. In other words, is it a one-time thing? Is it what are the in other words, what are the downsides of this overwhelming experience? In other words, is it a one-time thing? Can we recreate it? Yeah. So let's circle back to that in a
Okay.
minute. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I think you mentioned that in the beginning that there are some natural laws that we can follow, and the revelation of God at Sinai kind of helps to make it more authoritative, right? But as far as the physical objects to become holy, it's easier to understand. But how can you influence the human being, even if you say that the God is authority? First of all, not everybody would believe that they say they believe in different gods, and it's much more complicated. And I think, as you said, it's still a ladder, still a process. But how do we make sense of it, and um, how can we live in a world where even knowing that it was authority who stated the moral laws, it's still not universal for everybody?
Okay. Now I have a lot on my plate. Now I'm in trouble. Now I have too much. Now I have too much on my plate. So I don't know if I can address the entirety of your question because that will get us um, 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 that will get us a little too far from where we need to go. But let me take part of your question. Let me take the part of the question which really comes back to the question of what we started with is why the Ten Commandments, why these simple matters. So I'm going to circle back to that. Let me say a few words on this, and if you want to discuss further, let me know, and then maybe I don't know if we'll be able to do it today because that's a broad subject. We did a little bit of it on Tuesday, as you know. Okay, let's think about this for a second. You have to divide, as Vicky says, between the physical and the spiritual. You have the ideas, and then you have the objects of the world. And the theory is that what happens at Sinai is not the information. The patriarchs knew the information. The Torah, like I said, the Midrash says that the sages kept the Torah before it was given, for the most part. Not everything, but for the most part. So what happens is now the physical object could be permeated with holiness. Now, when you put up a mezuzah, the object is holy. The patriarchs, before the giving of a Torah, there's no such idea. It's an impossibility. It's an absurdity. Why is it an absurdity? Because spiritual and physical are two different realities. They don't work by the same rules. They don't interact with each other, and they're a side by side would be a compliment. They're just a different realm. They don't communicate. There's no point there's no interface between the two of them. So we say, what is that Sinai? Sinai is now we have the ability to affect the physical world. Okay, all true. Let's go back to Vicky's point. The attitude of pre-Sinai, so now we have a pre-Sinai attitude and a post-Sinai attitude. A pre-Sinai attitude, unfortunately, is prevalent in many philosophies and religions, but Judaism is really a rebellion against that. Is that I have a spiritual side and I have a materialistic side or a daily side, and they don't mix. In other words, there's a division between the house of worship and and the way I am in my daily interactions. So once a week, I go to the house of worship, I pay my dues, I do my confession, whatever I do, and now, but don't bother me in the way I live my life, right? I'm willing to sign up once a week and pay my dues and leave me alone. In other words, there's a division between the spiritual side of self and the daily life. Judaism says no, that's not the way it works. The whole point of Judaism is that it affects the way you live your daily life. So in other words, you could live your daily life, even if you're a very good person. If you're a bad person, so if you in other words, you don't have good behavior, then shape up. But even if you have good behavior and you say, I'm a moral person, I don't steal, I don't kill. I don't need God for that. I could learn, like I could figure this out on my own logically. And if I need to really be philosophical, I'll go to natural law, which was very common in the Enlightenment is based on natural law. Certainly, in the American philosophers, in other words, the American British philosophers, they're very into the natural law because they want to say we need morality. Maybe we don't get it from God, we'll get it from nature. Okay, so that's fine. That's a wonderful thing. I'm a wonderful person. I don't kill. I don't steal. I'm moral. Wonderful. But Judaism says you want to bring holiness even into those areas of life, not just the physical objects, but also the logical parts of self. And we say that even when I do something that's logical, that's sort of the natural side of self, that too should be permeated with holiness. And I say, actually, not killing is not just a it's not just a logical exercise, it's also a spiritual exercise. In other words, you're bringing the spirituality to every side of life, including the mind and the ethical behavior on a day to day basis. And that too is, in a way, the division between breaking the division between heaven and earth, metaphorically, is also between heaven and earth within the person, between the spiritual side of self and the more tangible, physical, logical side of self. And in a way, if you keep the commandments, even the logical commandments of the Ten Commandments, and and you do that because God told you so, so now you're bridging the spiritual side and the physical side, and the spiritual side and the logical side of self within yourself. Now that you're addressing a separate question, which is why that's critical. And that's a discussion which I could start, we could talk about it. I just don't know that right now is the best time. We can talk about this, that could you really have morality just based on human logic? And that's an important question. I have my opinion. People will disagree, but that's already another whole discussion. But you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to say is that that's where I started out with the Ten Commandments as simple matters. There's a beautiful, beautiful verse from King David's Book of Psalms that the Rebbe once taught when he taught this concept, even though this concept he repeated so many times. This is basically bread and butter concept of Hasidic philosophy. Especially, that's why Judaism is, of course, obsessed with physical commandments and commandments that are done in a very specific time, in a very specific place. It's all very grounded because the whole purpose of Judaism would be to ground this experience. And if before the giving of a Torah, the idea of spirituality, which is now common with other faiths, is to try to transcend the physical and try to go to heaven. And in Judaism, it's like, at least Hasidic, at least from the perspective of Hasidism, it's Judaism, but Hasidism emphasizes this. That's not the point of the giving of a Torah. The point of giving a Torah is not to be like angels. God has plenty, plenty of angels. The purpose is, could you come down into this physical world and sanctify the physical? And ultimately, that's the purpose of creation. Let's find this beautiful, beautiful psalm. Um, okay, I'm going to succumb and get help from our good friends at Google, because for some reason, no, I'm going to try one more place. Yeah, beautiful. Psalms 42, I'm going to share it on the screen. It's so beautiful. Psalm 42. Chabad. Maybe one day we should do Psalms. We did some of the writings. We did some of the Song of Songs during the pandemic. I don't want another pandemic, but we need more time to do Psalms. Okay, this is a beautiful Psalm, Psalm 42. What's the beauty? What's beauty of Psalm 42? King David talks about how he thirsts for God, just like a uh, ayal is a ram. Here they translate a hart is thirsting for water, and it's very poetic. The English is not great, but I'm saying the English is fine, but it's not as poetic. But the Hebrew is beautiful. So I'm going to read 4 verses, and we'll give the Hasidic insight on verse 4. So for the conductor, a maskil of the sons of Korach. Okay, that's the introduction. As a hart cries longingly for rivulets of water, hart as in a, ayal as in a ram, so does my soul cry longingly to you, O God. My soul thirsts for you, God, for the living God. When will I come and appear before God? In other words, David is running away from Jerusalem, and he's on the run, but he wants to come back, and he wants to sort of feel close to Hashem. My tears were my bread day and night, when they say to me all day long, where is your God? This is a very, very sad verse. It's basically saying that all David's adversaries, and he had a tricky life. He had to run away from the previous king. He had to ultimately run away from his own son, rebellion of his own son, Absalom. But in any case, he says, people, all day, all I have is tears. In other words, my bread, all I eat, my bread day and night is my tears. Why is he crying so much? He's crying so much because people ask him, where is your God? Meaning, if God is so great and God is so powerful and you're so loyal to him, why doesn't he protect you? Which unfortunately, with all the Jewish suffering in the last 2,000 years, this was a very important cry. Where is God? How come he's not there when we need him? And that's David thirsting for God and crying. That's a very beautiful and moving few verses. There are beautiful songs written on verse 2 and verse 3, both Hasidic and modern Hasidic, but that's already for another discussion. But here's the Hasidic interpretation of verse 4. My tears were my bread day and night, when they say to me all day long, where is your God? So you put the comma, when they say to me all day long, comma, where is your God? That's the way you read it in this verse. The Hasidic interpretation is going to move the comma. My tears were my bread day and night, when they say to me, comma, all day long, where is your God? In other words, the question a person has to ask himself is, where is my God all day long? Yes, I know on the weekend or on the high holidays or every morning when I go to synagogue, I pray, I put on tefillah and I say Shema. There I have a connection to God. But the question is, all day long, where is your God? In other words, are you connected to God? Are you bringing the holiness when you eat, when you drink, when you do business, everything you do? If you do it for a spiritual purpose, then your God is with you all day long. So in the simple interpretation, it's David calling out to God and saying, God, where are you? But on the Hasidic interpretation, it's the person calling to himself and basically talking about that dichotomy that sometimes we feel, where we have a spiritual side and then we have a practical side, and they don't mix. And even if I have a very deep spiritual connection to God, the question is, when I pray, when I study, the question is all day long, where is my God? And that's the calling of Sinai. And all day long is also every part of me, even the parts of me that are logical. And I understand that this is ethical behavior, but I also understand that it's also a commandment from Hashem. And that's what gives it not just the idea that it's a nice idea, but it also gives it the absolute resolve that a person needs to be moral. Because it's very easy to be moral when it makes sense and it aligns with when it's convenient. But then when a person is pressured, and a person could find all different reasons why he shouldn't be moral, then you need the absolute authority. And the absolute authority is this is the will of God, this is in the Ten Commandments. And the point is that that's also a connection with not just every part of my life, not only every object could be sanctified, not only every part of the day could be sanctified, but also the different parts of me. The idea that I have a spiritual side, a transcendent side, and then a logical, practical side, that is true. I do have those. There still has heaven and earth. We're not diluting what is heaven, what is earth. But they could touch each other. They can kiss each other. They could connect.
That was so beautiful, Rabbi. Thank you so much. And I wish you do some class on Psalms because I know people of different faiths read Psalms too. It will be very beneficial. I mean, that was a beautiful answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we had a great we had Manis Friedman here, Rabbi Manis Friedman here last weekend, and he said a story that once a person who was Jewish and he decided he wants to convert before or after he goes to speak to the rabbi, and the rabbi says, "Why do you want to convert?" I think it was Christianity. He says, "Because they have beautiful books." He says, "Really? What kind of books do they have?" So he says, "Oh, they have Isaiah." So he said, "Oh yeah, we have a translation of that into Hebrew," which is of course a joke because Isaiah is originally in the Hebrew Bible and in Hebrew. So yeah, everybody has Psalms, but it's our book. Yes. Okay, so that's the idea, and that's the big idea. And in some ways, if you want to say what is the difference between Judaism and other faiths, I'm no expert in other faiths, but I think this is correct, that ultimately what all faiths try to do is ultimately the ultimate purpose is to get to heaven. Ultimately, it's a path to heaven. How do you get to heaven? Either in this world or in the world to come. Do this, and you're saved. Where are you saved? In heaven. Do this, and you could be able to become spiritual and not only religions, but also mystical traditions or Eastern traditions. The ultimate goal is to meditate and to reach a state of transcendence and separate from the distractions of civilization. And a lot of spiritual seekers and religious seekers, when they come to Judaism, certainly traditional Judaism, it's a big turnoff because it's the exact opposite orientation. It's not about going to heaven. Yes, sometimes we have spiritual experiences. We fast on Yom Kippur, we transcend, we pray, we say Shema, we cover our eyes, all wonderful things. But ultimately, that's not the goal. That's just a means to the end. That's just a means so that when you come back to the world, you are sanctifying it and you are permeating every part of your life with holiness and with goodness. And so the orientation is the exact opposite of every other faith. And not always people understand this and understand the radical position of Judaism because it's a radical idea that a physical object could be permeated with holiness, not just as a symbol. You see, symbolism is a different story. Symbolism is that when I do this, it reminds me of something else, right? When I do this, it reminds me of God, it reminds me of my grandmother. That's fine. That symbolism is easy. But we're not talking about symbolism. In fact, symbolism in Judaism, we don't like symbolism. We don't like symbolism of God, certainly not, because it's the opposite. God has no image. But so when we do a mitzvah, it's not a symbol and it's also not a ritual, depending what you mean by ritual. But if you think about ritual as we do this to remind us of something else, then if that's the case, then it's not a ritual. It's a commandment, and commandment has the meaning of in Hebrew mitzvah tzavta is togetherness. You're really connecting. It's connection. And when you do a mitzvah, you are connecting the physical and the spiritual with the purpose of sanctifying the physical. Okay, so that's the big idea. Now we want to get to Bob's idea. Bob says, one second. Is this a one-time event? Did God do it and then we lost it? Do we have to try to recreate it? What exactly is happening here? So the short answer is as follows. It's not the short answer, but it's a little bit of a it's a little bit of a complex answer. Because the answer is that God has to do it. But look at the metaphor. God says, look at the Medrash. God says, therefore, I am descending on Mount Sinai. So, but if you look at the metaphor, it doesn't say the people of Rome will go to Syria, but it says the people of Rome will go to Syria and Syria will go to Rome. And the Medrash continues, the ones above come down to earth and the ones from below go up. In other words, you have to have a true track direction. Heaven has to come down to earth and earth has to be elevated to heaven. And God says, I'm going to descend on Mount Sinai. And then it says, the Medrash says, and to Moses, he says, go up the mountain, ascend the mountain and ascend to the Lord. And Moshe is on the mountain for 40 days. So there are two directions here. But the broader point is as follows. We understand that for change to happen or for internalization to take place, I think internalization is better than change. It has to come, it cannot be superimposed. If God were to descend and God were to say, I'm here, this is what I want you to do, it's actually not a moment of internalization. It'll be an experience that's overwhelming, but not internalized. And the case in point is 40 days after the giving of the Torah, God says, don't serve idols, they serve idols. And everyone says, how could you serve idols right after this greatest revelation of God? And the answer is because revelations, they're superimposed. Something from outside of you, an event that happens from outside of you is not going to change you. It could inspire you, It could catch your attention. It could move you, but it's not going to change you. Internalization has to come from within. Change has to come from within. And that process takes time. And this leads to all kinds of interesting points that I alluded to in this parsha, really all over the parsha. But I'm just going to talk about one of those cases because we have to finish a little bit early today. It's a bit busy weekend in Chabad. They have a conference of all the Chabad emissaries, the women, the Rebbitzins. So the men are a little bit on their own this week. So it's a little tricky. In any case, here's the thing. When you read about the preparation for Sinai, the Jewish people come to Sinai, and God says as follows, and this is in the Torah, God says, make a fence, make a border around the mountain. Nobody should touch the mountain. Anyone who ascends the mountain will die. Makes sense? God's coming down on the mountain. The mountain is holy. If you get too much holiness, you can get zapped, right? If you have electricity, and the electricity is great, but if you have too much electricity running through your light bulb, it's going to explode. So holiness is wonderful. God's presence is wonderful. Too much is no good. By the way, what the first thing the Jewish people say after the giving of the Torah, the first thing they say is, please, Moses, please tell God we don't want to hear him talk to us. It's too overwhelming. You speak to him and then come back and tell us what to do. It's an overwhelming experience. So the first thing we're going to come to Sinai is Moshe says, the God tells Moshe, make sure you tell them to make a border around the mountain and not climb the mountain. And there's a back and forth because Moshe says they know they're not going to want to go. God says, no, make sure you tell them. Meaning, sometimes when you have an overwhelming experience, you're drawn to it. You want to see this experience, and it's going to be harmful. Okay. But what happens is the first thing God says right away, right at the beginning, which is 3 days before, I'm sorry, it's like he says it 3 days before, I think it's 3 days. He says it at least 3 days before the giving of the Torah. He says, by the way, the second the ceremony is over, whoever wants can climb the mountain. So he says, please make sure nobody knows, nobody touches the mountain, make a border around, anyone touches it will die. But as soon as you hear the Jubilee, as soon as you hear the shofar, meaning the ceremony is over, anyone can climb the mountain. Now I ask you, why is that so important to tell them at the time? After the giving of the Torah, God should say, oh, by the way, the ceremony is over. The actors went home. The show is over. Anyone can climb the mountain. But what's the point if you're trying to tell people to stay away and you're trying to put the fear of God in them, saying, stay away from this mountain because it's dangerous? Why do you have to tell them immediately, by the way, this is only temporary. As soon as the shofar sounds, anyone can climb the mountain. And the answer is because that's the whole, that God has to signal right away. That the downside of Sinai is that God descends, and God is sort of busting through the barrier between physical and spiritual. But that ultimately doesn't create internalization. Internalization is once God does his work, now we have to climb the mountain. In other words, the mountain is not sanctified until we bring holiness to the place. It has to come from within. And therefore, you have a fascinating contrast between Sinai and the Temple Mountain. The Temple Mountain in Jerusalem is considered holy even after the temple is destroyed. And there's a lot of halachic ramifications. You're not allowed to go to the Temple Mountain. Now there's controversy. Where could you go? Where could you not go? We're not going to get into that. But certainly where this temple stood, the area where the temple stood, you're not allowed to go. It's holy. Even though the temple is not here, you're not allowed to go there. We're ritually impure. You have to become ritually pure before you can go there. And technically now we cannot become ritually impure without getting into all the details. The place of the Temple Mountain is holy forever because that space the holiness has been internalized into that physical space. Sinai, it's temporary. In fact, we don't even know where Sinai is. In other words, the Jewish people do not have a tradition where Sinai is. There are other people who have traditions. That Muslims have a tradition. They call it, I think, Nebe Musa, the mountain of Moses, I think. And people go there. People took pictures there when Israel still controlled it. There were a lot of people who went there, photographers and painters. And everybody and people have theories where Sinai is, but nobody knows for sure. Why don't we know? The short answer is, I hate to tell you, I hate to say this so bluntly, the short answer is that nobody cares. In other words, the space of Sinai is not important. The ideas of Sinai, oh, that's world changing. But where exactly, which little mountain, which pieces of earth, where that happened, which sand, which exactly particles of sand were there when God spoke, is not interesting. Why isn't it interesting? And why is the Temple Mountain interesting? The answer is very simple. When God comes to Sinai, God comes from above. When God comes from above, it makes a change, but it's only the beginning. And the holiness would not permeate in the long run. For the holiness to permeate in the long run, you need people's involvement. You need the people to do certain things. And that's why the Temple Mountain, where it's all about the people actually selected the place. God confirmed, but King David, as a representative of the people, selected the place and built the home, and the people came and offered their offerings there, etc., etc. That is a place that, because there's human involvement, that's why the holiness remains in that space. So back to Bob's question. What is Sinai? Is Sinai the one-time event that we'll never have again? Sinai, and the answer is Sinai, I hate to say this, the experience of Sinai also was a beginning, but don't overestimate it. In other words, it has its shortcomings. The awesomeness of Sinai is that now it gives us the ability. God sort of busts through the division, and now there's a bridge. And now if you want to climb the mountain, you can climb the mountain. So when God comes down with the thunder, with the lightning, what is a noise? What is noise? Noise means you're shattering the order. When somebody sees something like frightening or unusual or he never saw before, you shout and you say, wow, that's the noise. The noise is something crazy is happening. What's crazy? Holiness is coming into this world. But is it going to last? No. And the calling of Sinai is, now that we have the empowerment, now the calling of Sinai is that we now climb the mountain. And there's a beautiful commentator by a Hasidic, it's a Kabbalistic commentary, not Hasidic, but the Malbim, and he says a beautiful, beautiful subtlety. In Hebrew, sometimes you should and you could, it's very hard to differentiate with the grammar. So I translated the verse the way most people translate, B'mshoch hayovel, once the shofar sounds, Hey mayalu bahar, they may, meaning the people may climb the mountain. But if you want to translate the verse literally, it doesn't say may. It says they should. They should climb the mountain. In other words, in the beginning, you can't come close to Sinai because God is descending. But then after God descends, we have to climb the mountain. We have to recreate that experience. And the history from Sinai until the Messianic era is basically where we're going to recreate at Sinai, but this time not top down, but bottom up. Through our action, through our day-to-day's connection of bringing heaven down to earth and elevating the earth, and every part of life and every part of the day is holy. It doesn't look holy. It looks like I'm just doing things that everybody else is doing. I'm eating, I'm drinking, I'm taking care of my needs. It seems just like human functions or even biological functions. This is all earth, but this is all when a Jew does it with the perspective and the purpose of, I'm doing this to be able to make the world a better place. Then you're bringing the holiness to every area of your life. And then where is God? Not only where is God when you pray and when you study and when you go to shul, but where is God all day? All day God is with you. So that's the story in short. We'll stop a little early today, but it's a pleasure seeing everybody, and I hope this was enjoyable and inspirational. And the bottom line is that after Sinai, we don't wait for the inspiration to come from above, but we generate our own inspiration. We climb the mountain and we fulfill the purpose, which is to take all the blessings that God gives us and use them consistent with the purpose, which is to make the world a better place. And by doing so, the world itself is sanctified. And like Bob keeps reminding us, ultimately the entire world becomes Eden, and that's the Messianic era. So l'chaim, and thank you for joining, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Amen. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, Karina.
Shabbat
Thank you.
Shalom.
Thank you, Oren. Thank you. Shabbat shalom.